The twin moons cast their pallid glow over the Red River, staining its slow-moving waters in hues of rust and silver. Captain Cale Varen sat alone in the cockpit of his scout skimmer, letting the hum of the repulsor field fill the silence. Out here, on the far edge of the frontier, silence meant life. Noise meant someone was careless. And Cale had spent enough years in war to know that carelessness got men killed. The scanner pulsed in a slow rhythm, picking up nothing but the occasional shift of sand beneath the river's surface. He took a sip from a metal flask, the bitter taste grounding him. The night was too still, and stillness had a weight to it, a heaviness that came before storms or bad news. His mind drifted to the last supply run, the negotiations with the settlement elders over patrol routes. It had been a simple arrangement. Cale would keep the river clear of raiders, and they would keep the water routes open for trade. A clean deal, one of the few on this planet that hadn't been twisted by greed. The console blinked once. A sharp, short signal broke the stillness. His eyes narrowed as he tapped the screen. It wasn't one of his usual channels, this was a broad-spectrum distress call, weak and irregular. Whoever sent it was either too far away or too close to dying. He adjusted course, the skimmer gliding forward with a faint hiss over the water. The Red River's mist curled in tendrils around the hull, hiding the banks from sight. When the shoreline came into view, Cale saw fire. It rose in jagged columns from the settlement ahead, orange against the pale moons. His chest tightened as he throttled up the skimmer, the sound of its engines suddenly loud in his ears. Structures along the waterline were collapsing in on themselves, burning where plasma shots had struck. The smell of scorched metal and flesh reached him before he even docked. He jumped from the skimmer, boots sinking slightly into the ashen mud. Figures lay sprawled in the dirt, the jagged patterns of the wounds telling him this was no pirate work. Pirates sprayed fire wildly, leaving chaos. These wounds were precise, every shot aimed to kill. A voice called his name from across the square. Commander Darius Holt emerged from the smoke, rifle slung across his back. His face was grim, the kind of grim Cale had seen only on soldiers who had already taken in every ugly detail and accepted what it meant. They clasped forearms briefly, not wasting time on words of greeting. "You see the pattern?" Darius asked, voice low, as if the dead might still hear. Cale nodded, scanning the rooftops for movement. Military precision. This wasn't a raid, it was an execution. Mercenaries, Darius confirmed. But not the local kind. Geese too advanced, too uniform. They knew exactly where to hit and how long to stay. They moved together through the smoke, stepping over shattered glass and bodies that had fallen where they stood. A faint sound broke through the crackle of flames, a low groan. Cale followed it, finding a man slumped against the charred remains of a wall. His uniform marked him as planetary defense, but the scorch across his chest plate told Cale he hadn't been on the winning side. The man's head lifted slightly. His face was pale beneath the suit, and his breathing came in shallow pulls. "Varen," he rasped. Cale crouched beside him. "Lieutenant Arden." "Miles," the man managed. He glanced to his side, where a woman lay, her hand still in his. Her eyes were half closed, her lips moving in the faintest whisper. Cale leaned closer, catching the word. A name. His own name. Her gaze fixed on him for the briefest instant before it clouded. He recognized her from a briefing months ago, Talia Arwayen, a tracker who had been working the frontier independently. She had been hunting a syndicate cell that had destroyed her home. She didn't draw another breath. Arden's grip tightened on Cale's arm. "She followed them across the river," he said, coughing. "Said they killed her family. Same killers as tonight. They're moving fast." Darius crouched on the other side, eyes narrowing. "The syndicate. Has to be. No one else runs cross-border strikes like this." Cale felt a cold knot form in his chest. The syndicate was more than a gang, it was a network, a war machine in exile. Ravik Oris, its leader, had been a general before exile turned him into something worse. If Ravik's men were striking settlements here, it meant they were planning something larger. "We'll get her justice," Cale said, though his voice was quieter than he intended. He helped Darius lift Arden, carrying him toward the skimmer. On the way back to the dock, Cale noticed something in the dirt, a boot print, deep and sharp-edged. It wasn't a common pattern, not one made on this side of the river. He crouched to study it. Whoever made it carried weight, moved with purpose. The mud still held its heat from the friction of the step. Recent. They loaded Arden onto the skimmer's bench, where the man slumped but kept his eyes open, determined to give them every detail he could. He spoke of a camp on the far bank, beyond the Red River's winding main channel. Ravik's forward base, hidden among canyon walls and defended by mercenaries from half a dozen worlds. Crossing that river meant stepping into a territory where maps were useless and every shadow might be a gun barrel. Cale had been across before, during the war, and each time he came back with fewer men than he left with. The skimmer's engines hummed to life, carrying them back toward Cale's own outpost. Darius stood beside him at the console, looking out at the dark waters. "This isn't just about one village," Darius said. "This is a campaign. They'll keep crossing until they control the river. After that, the settlements fall one by one." Cale didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, where the Red River curved into the night. The air above it shimmered faintly under the moons. Somewhere beyond that shimmer, Ravik Oris was preparing for another strike. And somewhere along that same bank, the tracks of a dying woman's hunt still waited to be followed. The dock came into view, a strip of metal and wood jutting into the river's slow current. The skimmer slid into place with a soft bump. Cale stepped out, scanning the darkened shoreline. "We go after them," he said finally. "We cross the river, find their camp, and end this before they make another move." Darius gave a slow nod. "You know what's waiting over there." Cale's mouth curved into something that might have been a smile if there had been any humor in it. "I do. And so do they." The river mist swirled between them, carrying the smell of burning from the ruined settlement. Cale knew they were stepping into a fight that wouldn't end with one battle. But the choice had been made. Some debts were too old to forget, and some names were spoken with a dying breath for a reason. They would cross the Red River. And they would not come back without the killers. Dawn crept over the river like a hesitant hand, the pale light turning the mist to molten silver. Cale stood at the edge of the dock, boots braced on weathered planks, studying the water as if it might offer an answer. The Red River's wide expanse shifted and whispered, its sluggish current hiding the scars of old wars. He could almost see the ghosts of battles past in the ripples, men and machines swallowed by its depths, their bones silted over and forgotten. Behind him, Darius oversaw the loading of supplies onto the stealth vessel. The craft was lean and angular, built for speed and silence, its hull coated in a matte alloy that scattered scanning beams. 2 pulse rifles were secured along the port wall, their polished metal catching brief flashes of morning light. Crates of rations and medical kits slid into compartments with practiced efficiency. Arden sat on a low crate nearby, his face pale under a fresh layer of bandages, watching the preparations with the focused stillness of someone unwilling to be left behind. "You should be on a med transport," Cale said without looking at him. "And let you two go alone." Arden's voice was rough but steady. "Not happening." Cale didn't argue further. The lieutenant had lost people the same night Talia had fallen. That kind of grief had a way of hardening into a single, sharp point, a point that wanted to strike back. Cale recognized it because he carried it himself. The vessel's systems came online with a low hum. Darius moved to the helm, his broad frame filling the narrow space. Cale stepped aboard, taking position at the forward console. Arden settled in behind them, one hand resting lightly on the grip of his sidearm. The gangway retracted, and the craft slid from the dock into the river's slow embrace. As they moved away from the settlement's ruins, the world seemed to close in. The riverbanks were lined with jagged black rock, streaked with mineral veins that gleamed faintly in the sun's early light. Occasional flashes of movement stirred beneath the surface, too quick to identify. Cale kept the sensors running at full sweep, scanning for patrol drones or syndicate outposts. The water here was a border, and borders were never empty. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the muted churn of the vessel's drives. Darius kept their course tight to the southern bank, where the rock overhangs provided partial cover from aerial sweeps. Twice, Cale caught faint pings on the radar, mechanical signatures moving against the current. The first drifted away before they made visual contact. The second lingered. "Starboard side," Cale murmured. A shape surfaced 30 meters out, a segmented ridge rising from the water, glistening with algae and machine oil. The ridge split open to reveal rows of serrated metal plates. A river leviathan. Its massive body arched above the surface, water cascading from armored plating as it turned its eyeless head toward the vessel. Darius angled away, engines throttling just enough to avoid sudden bursts of noise. The creature followed, its wake rocking the stealth craft. A deep vibration resonated through the hull as it closed the distance. Cale moved to the rail, rifle in hand, and sighted along the waterline. He waited until the Leviathan breached again, then fired 3 quick shots into the gap between its plates. Steam hissed from the wounds, and the creature thrashed, tail striking the river like a hammer. Arden was already at the port rail, adding his fire to Cale's. The combined shots sent the Leviathan sinking back into the depths, leaving only a wide swirl of water behind. Cale exhaled slowly, lowering his rifle. "They weren't here last year," Darius said from the helm. "Not in this stretch." "They're being herded," Cale replied. "Driven upriver to make crossing harder." The thought settled like cold lead in the air. If the Syndicate was altering the river's hazards, it meant they were preparing for something sustained, something that would need the far bank defended. By midday, the northern cliffs came into view, towering walls of red stone that marked the edge of Syndicate territory. Thin plumes of smoke curled from somewhere deep within the canyons. The sensors detected faint energy spikes, too low to be open fire but too regular to be natural. They brought the vessel in beneath an overhang, letting the shadow hide their approach. Darius powered down to minimal output, and the sudden quiet seemed to make every drip of water and shift of stone louder. Cale scanned the cliffside through magnifiers, noting the faint shimmer of a camouflaged watchpost. A man in dark armor stood within the shimmer, a rifle slung across his chest, his gaze sweeping lazily across the river. "They're expecting us to come in high profile," Arden said. "We slip past, they won't notice until we're deep in." Cale nodded. "But we'll need a guide once we're across. Someone who knows the canyons." Darius glanced over his shoulder. "And where do you suggest we find someone like that?" The question was answered sooner than any of them expected. A shape emerged from behind the cliff's lower edge, a small fishing skiff, pushed along by a single mechanical oar. The man at its bow was wiry, weathered by sun and wind, his face half hidden by a wide-brimmed hat. He eyed their craft without surprise, as if he had been waiting. Cale stepped to the rail. "You know these canyons?" The man's mouth twisted into a faint smile. "I know where not to go." Within the hour, the skiff was lashed to their hull, and the stranger was aboard. His name was Bren Cole, a former smuggler who claimed to have run syndicate shipments before turning to less dangerous trades. Cale didn't trust him, but the man's knowledge of unmarked channels through the cliffs was too valuable to dismiss. With Bren guiding them, they slipped past the watchpost under cover of jagged stone. The canyons opened into a network of narrow waterways, the cliffs rising so high they blocked much of the sun. Echoes distorted every sound, making distance difficult to judge. Once, Cale caught the faint whine of an engine, but Bren signaled them to hold position until it faded. By the time they emerged from the last bend, the light had shifted toward evening. A cluster of low structures clung to the bank ahead, their walls patched with mismatched metal and scavenged plating. The smell of cooked fuel drifted on the air. Syndicate territory. Cale powered down the drives, letting the vessel drift. "We go in quiet. No one sees us unless we want them to." Darius checked his rifle. Arden followed suit. Bren gave no sign of hearing, already steering them toward a narrow gap between 2 outbuildings. The current carried them through into a sheltered cove. From here, Cale could see movement on the shore, armed men, laughing, drinking from tin flasks. Bren pointed toward a low warehouse near the waterline. "That's where you'll find your first answers." Cale didn't ask how Bren knew. Some knowledge came from talk, some from scars. They made landfall under cover of the cove's shadows, moving between stacks of rusted cargo crates. The air was thick with the smell of oil and wet stone. From inside the warehouse came the sound of voices arguing, low but heated. Cale edged closer, catching fragments of conversation. Ravik wants it done in 2 days, no survivors this time. Crossing again? That'll bring the patrols down on us. Patrols don't matter when you own the river. Kale's pulse slowed, not from calm but from focus. The words fit too neatly with Darius's fears. The syndicate wasn't just raiding, they were clearing the riverbank for something bigger, something permanent. He stepped back into the shadows, eyes meeting Darius's. No words were needed. The mission had just become more urgent, and the path forward more dangerous. They slipped away from the warehouse, moving back toward the vessel without drawing attention. The night air over the river was colder now, and the current felt heavier beneath the hull. Kale stood at the prow, watching the black water ahead. Somewhere in these canyons lay the base Arden had described, and with it, the man who had ordered Talia's death. They would find it. And when they did, the river would run red for reasons other than the iron in its soil. Night held the canyons in a grip of cold and silence, the kind that seeped into the bones. Kale moved ahead of the others, his boots soundless on the uneven stone. The stealth vessel was hidden in a narrow inlet behind them, cloaked beneath a screen of jagged rock. In this stretch of syndicate territory, light was a liability, so they worked in shadow, guided by the faint glimmer of starlight on the cliffs above. Bren walked a pace behind Kale, his steps unhurried but deliberate, like a man who had walked these paths too many times to be careless. Darius brought up the rear, scanning the high ridges for movement while keeping one hand on the grip of his rifle. Arden stayed between them, his breathing steady despite the bandages that still bound his ribs. They had been tracking syndicate patrol routes for 2 days, striking from cover and vanishing before reinforcements could respond. Each skirmish brought them scraps of information, whispered warnings from terrified deserters, hastily drawn maps from traders eager to be left alive. The picture was coming together piece by piece, and Kale could see the shape of it now. The forward base wasn't a temporary camp. It was a fortress, built to last, positioned where the cliffs narrowed into a choke point above the Red River. They stopped at the edge of a shallow ravine, crouching low. Across the gap, 3 syndicate soldiers picked their way along a ridge trail, rifles slung but ready. Kale signaled, and the group split. Darius circled wide, vanishing into the rock shadows, while Kale and Arden waited. When the patrol drew level, Darius rose behind them, silent as the wind, and pressed his rifle's muzzle to the nearest back. Kale and Arden stepped out in unison, weapons raised. The soldiers froze. 2 dropped their rifles instantly. The third hesitated just long enough for Kale to notice the shift in his stance, feet bracing, hand twitching toward his sidearm. Kale fired a single shot into the dirt at his feet. The man flinched, and his weapon clattered to the stones. They herded the 3 into a narrow cleft between rocks where sound wouldn't carry. Bren stood watch at the opening while Kale questioned them. The answers came slowly, forced out by the pressure of silence and the weight of a rifle barrel. The base was 2 days upriver by foot, hidden in a hollow where the cliffs folded in on themselves. Ravik Oris was there, overseeing preparations for another crossing. And Talia Arwayen's name meant something to them. One of the soldiers smirked when it was mentioned, muttering about the one who wouldn't quit. Kale felt the smirk like a blade drawn slow. He stepped closer, voice low and even. "Where is she?" The smirk faltered. The man swallowed and shook his head. "She's dead. Took her 2 nights ago when she tried to get in through the old spillway. She's probably..." He didn't finish. Arden's fist caught him across the jaw, dropping him to the ground. Kale said nothing. He knew the truth already, but hearing it confirmed tightened the resolve in his chest. They left the soldiers bound in the cleft and moved on. The trail narrowed until it was no more than a ribbon of stone between cliff and river, forcing them into single file. The current below glimmered faintly, the moonlight catching on swirls of red sediment. By the next evening, the cliffs parted just enough to reveal a long shelf of rock jutting out over the river. At its far end stood a cluster of ruined outbuildings, their walls half collapsed but still offering cover. Smoke curled lazily from a small fire within. Darius went ahead to scout. When he returned, his face was grim. "Deserters. Maybe half a dozen. They've got syndicate rifles but no discipline. Could be useful if they're willing to talk." Bren grunted. Or dangerous if they're not. They approached openly, weapons lowered but visible. The deserters eyed them with suspicion, hands never far from their triggers. Their leader was a broad-shouldered man with a scar running from his brow to his jaw. He introduced himself as Varin, and his voice carried the easy calm of someone used to giving orders. Kale kept his tone neutral. "We're looking for Ravik Oris. We know his base is upriver." "You've been there." Varin didn't deny it. "We've been there. We left. Ravik doesn't pay deserters, and he doesn't forgive them either. You want to get inside, you'll need more than luck." Darius leaned in. "Then help us. We'll make sure you stay alive." The man studied them for a long moment, then agreed, but Kale caught the flicker in his eyes, an instinctive calculation. Deals in places like this rarely came without a hidden cost. That night, they camped in the shelter of the ruined buildings. The fire was small, shielded from the river, its light barely touching the surrounding rock. The air was thick with unspoken mistrust. Bren kept to himself, eyes on the shadows. Arden sat apart, methodically cleaning his rifle. Kale didn't sleep deeply. Near midnight, a faint scrape of stone pulled him from half-dreams. He rose silently and caught sight of Varin slipping toward the river with two of his men. Kale followed, keeping to the shadows. The deserters were speaking in low voices, too low to make out the words, but the way they moved told Kale enough. They were signaling someone on the far bank. The crack of a rifle broke the quiet, echoing hard against the cliffs. Kale moved without thinking, his shot dropping one of Varin's men before the echo faded. The other turned his weapon toward him, but Bren appeared out of the dark, blade flashing once across the man's throat. Varin stumbled back, hands raised. "You were going to bring them down on us," Kale said, voice flat. Varin tried to speak, but Kale's stare cut the words short. "You're alive because we need the map in your head. You try again, I won't hesitate." By morning, the deserters were gone, sent back the way they'd come with a clear warning. The rest of the journey they made alone. Late on the second day, they reached high ground where the cliffs bent inward, forming a natural bowl. Through Kale's magnifier, the fortress came into view, a sprawling complex of reinforced stone and steel, its outer walls bristling with mounted guns. Small figures moved along the battlements, and the faint hum of power generators drifted up to where they lay hidden. Near the main gate, two guards dragged a figure between them. Even from this distance, Kale knew the set of her shoulders. Talia Awen was alive, but barely. Her head hung forward, her movements sluggish. The guards hauled her inside without ceremony. Arden's knuckles whitened around his rifle. "We have to move now." Kale lowered the magnifier slowly. The sight of her alive shifted the plan from calculated infiltration to something far more immediate. Ravik's camp was heavily armed, and an assault without preparation would be close to suicide. But every hour they waited was another hour Talia might not have. The wind stirred across the cliff, carrying the distant clang of metal from the fortress below. Kale's gaze stayed fixed on the gates, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the quiet certainty of a man who had already made his choice. "We move tonight." The fortress crouched above the Red River like a predator at rest, its walls catching the faint starlight in dull metallic glints. From their position on the cliff, Kale studied every inch of the structure, committing the guard rotations to memory. The outer wall was manned in pairs, each watchtower overlapping the next in a precise arc of coverage. Inside, faint lines of movement marked the patrols between the main gate and the inner compound. He knew the discipline in those patterns. Ravik Oris ran his forces like a war still being fought. Darius lay prone beside him, eyes on the south wall. "That's the weak point," he said quietly. "Only one guard cycle there, and it's the closest to the generators." Kale nodded. "We get inside, kill the power, and split them in the dark." Arden's voice was steady, but there was a sharp edge beneath it. "And Talia?" "She's in the inner compound," Kale said. "We take the south wall, breach the compound, and pull her out before they regroup." "Ravik's mine." Bren adjusted the straps on his pack, the faint rattle of gear inside barely audible. "You make your move quick enough, they'll still be asking who's shooting by the time you're walking her out." Kale waited until the moon slid behind a bank of clouds, then signaled them forward. They descended the cliff by rope, Boots finding silent purchase on the rock. The river whispered far below, its red-stained current indifferent to the men scaling its walls. At the base, they moved along the shadows until the south wall loomed above them. Darius was first up the grappling line, slipping over the wall with practiced ease. Cale followed, landing in a crouch beside the darkened corner of a storage building. The guard rounded the corner a heartbeat later and never saw the blade before it slid across his throat. Bren caught the body and lowered it soundlessly to the ground. Inside the perimeter, the air was thick with the smell of hot metal and engine grease. Cale led them to the generator compound, a squat building surrounded by stacked fuel drums. Two guards leaned against the wall, speaking in low tones. Darius dropped one with a suppressed shot, Bren silenced the other with a quick twist of steel. Cale placed the charges along the generator's base, setting the timers to 2 minutes. When they went off, the entire fortress would be plunged into darkness. The hum of the machines masked the faint click of the arming switches. They retreated to the shadow of a cargo stack and waited. The explosion came with a sharp crack and a bloom of orange light. The hum died instantly, replaced by shouts and the frantic clatter of boots on stone. Spotlights on the walls flickered and went out, leaving only the wash of starlight over the compound. Cale moved first, weaving through the chaos toward the inner compound. Gunfire erupted from the north wall, drawing syndicate forces in that direction. Bren had set the distraction as planned. Cale and Darius reached the inner gate and found two guards fumbling with their rifles in the dark. Arden cut them down with precise bursts, the reports muffled by the narrow space. Inside, the corridors twisted in sharp angles, every turn shadowed. Voices echoed faintly, and Cale followed them to a steel door at the far end. He pressed his ear to it and caught the harsh rhythm of Ravik Oris's voice. The words were indistinct, but the tone was unmistakable, command, absolute and unchallenged. He opened the door without hesitation. The room beyond was lit by a single hanging lamp, its glow falling across a large table covered in maps and weapon schematics. Ravik stood at the far end, tall and broad, his face lined with the kind of scars that never fully healed. He looked up, and recognition sparked in his eyes. Varen, Ravik said, the name like a weight. I wondered if the fire at the river was you. Cale stepped inside, rifle raised. You killed my family. You killed hers. This ends now. Ravik's mouth curved in something between a sneer and a smile. Your family died because they stood in my way. She hunts me because she doesn't understand the war she walked into. And you still think this is about revenge. Cale closed the distance, shoving the rifle's barrel against Ravik's chest. It's about ending you. The warlord moved faster than his size suggested, knocking the rifle aside and driving a fist into Cale's ribs. Pain flared hot and sharp, but Cale stayed upright, countering with a headbutt that split skin along Ravik's brow. The two men slammed into the table, scattering maps and weapons. Cale caught Ravik's wrist as the warlord drew a combat knife, twisting until bone strained. The fight was brutal and close, every strike carrying years of stored violence. Cale took a glancing slash across his forearm, feeling the heat of blood spill down his hand. Ravik staggered from a knee to the gut, but recovered with a swing that caught Cale across the jaw, sending him to one knee. From the corner of his vision, Cale saw movement, a shadow slipping in through the doorway. Arden appeared, rifle ready, but Cale raised a hand without looking. His mine. Ravik lunged, knife flashing. Cale sidestepped, catching Ravik's arm and driving the blade back into the warlord's side. The sound that escaped Ravik was more rage than pain. Cale forced him to the floor, the knife pressed to his throat. You don't get an easy death, Cale said, his voice low. You'll stand trial for every name, every place you burned. Ravik's eyes blazed, but the fight had gone out of him. Cale bound his wrists and left him on the floor, bleeding but alive. They found Talia in a cell 2 corridors away. She was gaunt, her wrists raw from restraints, but her eyes sharpened when she saw Cale. Arden moved to her side, cutting the bonds. She leaned on him but kept her gaze on Cale. Did you get him? His breathing, Cale said. For now. The extraction was chaos. The syndicate forces, disoriented by the blackout and the attacks on the walls, had no clear command. Bren guided them back to the south wall, where the grappling lines still hung. They descended into the darkness, the river's cold breath meeting them at the base. The stealth vessel waited in the shadow of the cliffs. They cast off without lights, letting the current carry them downriver until the fortress was just another jagged silhouette against the sky. Talia sat wrapped in a blanket, silent but awake, her gaze fixed on the passing water. Cale stood at the prow, the wind cool on his face. The red river stretched ahead, its surface glinting faintly where the moonlight touched it. He thought of the settlements along its banks, the people who would sleep easier without Ravik's shadow hanging over them. He thought of the woman who had spoken his name with her last breath, and of the one who had survived to see justice begin.